We are, however, at the end, finishing with Karl Friston, whom I'm sure you all know, so I won't introduce him further. Is there a unifying theory to unify unifying theories? So, Karl, look very much forward to you unpacking this for us. Thank you.
So it's a great pleasure to wind up this brilliant workshop. Normally my presentation is taken as a sort of light entertainment, and as I said yesterday, it usually degrades into a debrief about how well we've done. So I'm assuming that at some point we're going to get bored of talking about whole unifying brain theories, and I'm going to pass back to Michael, who I presume will then pass back to Randy, just to sort of bring things to closure. But in the interim, I'm going to try and answer the question. And I should say that this title is a wonderful title. It is not my title. It's something that Randy spent at least 2 weekends thinking about and crafting for me. And I've taken it very, very seriously. So I've done my best to try and find the theoretical frame that will happily embrace and comfort and validate everybody else's theories, not just the theories that we've been hearing about today, but all other theories that could be brought to the table to explain how we work. So if you've all enjoyed that lovely photograph, we'll move on to, if I can, here we go, slide 1. So the overarching notion is basically that we are creatures that are compelled to garner or search out evidence for our existence, and where our existence is entailed by our generative models of the world. And I'm articulating that just by saying that there are some internal brain states which represent expectations about hidden states outside the world, and we have some control variables or action variables U, both of which are in the service of maximizing the probability of any observable outcomes under a given model entailed by our brains. And we can split that into perception and action. Why is this unifying? Well, if you read that probability of the outcomes under a model as describing the kinds of outcomes that I, as this particular phenotype, expect to encounter, then we can read this log of the probability as value, as the utility of particular outcomes. That then endorses a description of our active engagement with the world in terms of reinforcement learning, optimal control theory. We've heard a lot about control theoretic approaches, but they rest upon a specification of this value function of some outcomes. In economics, it would be expected utility theory. This quantity here is going to be approximated with free energy, which is where the free energy principle gets into the game. But it's usually the free energy is articulated more from the point of view of information theory, where the negative value becomes self-information, surprisal or surprise, and the free energy now becomes a bound upon, i.e. in this instance, the negative free energy is always greater than the improbability of some outcome that would be very surprising if that outcome occurred to me. From that, we can license or talk about the principle of maximum mutual information, the Infomax principle, principles of maximum efficiency, minimum redundancy from Horace Barlow, and indeed the free energy principle. We've seen inspiration from Herman Hakens explicitly on paper, and also implicitly in terms of some of the work that Victor has drawn our attention to. That can be easily motivated by noting the time average of this self-information or surprise is entropy, which means action and perception on this reading of self-evidencing is really in the service of minimizing the entropy of outcomes. So we're talking about the holy grail of self-organization, formally articulated in terms of synergetics and laser physics. But if you are a physiologist, we're just talking about homeostasis, is keeping outcomes within viable physiological bounds. And then finally, if you're a statistician or from machine learning, you would read this quantity as a probability of some data, observable data, under a model, a Bayesian model. and that would be called Bayesian model evidence. And from that, we can spin off the Bayesian brain, evidence accumulation, and predictive coding on all that good stuff under the watchful eye of Hermann Helmholtz. So what is this evidence? It's usually written down in terms of a variational bound known as an elbow machine learning, an evidence lower bound, or a free energy bound, that is simply the log probability of outcomes given a model of how they were generated, that is formed by taking the thing we want and just putting something that can never be less than 0 on top of it to bound it. And that's the divergence between our beliefs queue about states of the affairs generating data and the true posterior, what's there given I could observe those data. And I'm writing that down just to motivate why this is potentially a very important, generic and almost universal way of defining optimality. You've got a generative model there that leads you to explainable artificial intelligence if you're in a pragmatic setting. You have a principled account of design optimality, and what we'll see in a second is also the way that you go and gather data that underwrites our abductive inferences. This cartoon that here with in terms of data foraging and epistemics. But what I want to do is just rearrange those terms at the top to provide another interpretation, which I think is much closer to some of the questions and issues that we've been contending with. I can rearrange those expressions and express evidence or evidence bound in terms of accuracy and complexity. So this is the sort of like the fitness, and you could think of this as basically the flexibility versus robustness. I hope I've got the right words from Randy's talk. In the sense that, you know, if you want a robust explanation of your world, then that has to be fairly accurate, but at the same time, it has to be expressive. So this is an interesting relationship because the evidence is the difference between accuracy and complexity, which means that if you want to provide an accurate account of the world, you are compelled to do so in the minimally complex way. So what does this complexity term look like? Well, it's just an expression of Occam's principle, in effect, finding the simplest explanation at hand that affords an accurate explanation of some observed outcomes. It is interesting also from a computer science point of view because it scores the degree of belief updating as you move from your prior beliefs to your posterior beliefs in the light of any new sensory evidence or any new data, which costs both in terms of the computational costs, but also in terms of the thermodynamic costs. So there's via the Jasinski equality and Landauer's principle, for every belief update that is measurable, you know, say with EEG or fMRI, there will be a number of joules that you have to expend to do that belief updating. So this is coming to Susan's recurrent focus on the actual thermodynamic and metabolic cost of belief updating. And there's a very simple relationship. It just scores the complexity, but also the complexity also holds the expressivity of the model. So as you're providing more and more accurate accounts, you'll need a more complex model, you need a more expressive model. So this speaks to this, you know, many of the talks, not, for example, and I'm going to miss a whole bunch of examples here, but what is in my mind is this sort of notion of hidden repertoires that could be brought to the table when apt explanations for this particular context in an expressive way. Another example of this is the increasing hierarchical depth of generative models endowed both by evolution but also by neurodevelopment in terms of pruning, synaptic homeostasis, that lead to these sparse structures. And why is sparse important? Well, it's just an expression of avoiding overly complex, overly parameterized generative models if you read synaptic connections as the parameters of those generative models. So a lot of, if you like, the imperatives, which we've seen beautifully unpacked for the pruning and the simplification of generative models and their implicit thermodynamic efficacy are basically written in just the definition, mathematical definition of model evidence. So I just want to close by saying that these principles also apply in relation to actively engaging with the world. So that the imperatives to maximize the accuracy of your explanations whilst minimizing their complexity translate into effectively maximizing the expected accuracy in terms of optimal Bayesian decisions, whilst the complexity term translates into a minimizing a cost in the sense of Bayes' optimal decisions, as opposed to design, which is getting the right kind of data to minimize your uncertainty about the causes of your data. So just written that out formally here, just re-expressing the evidence bound in terms of a mixture of accuracy and complexity, and asking what would this quantity or these imperatives so written out look like if I didn't actually have the outcomes, but I knew what they might look like under some policy pie, some action or move on the world. And just by taking the expectations, you can conceive of complexity and accuracy mapping to risk and ambiguity. So if I want to minimize this expected free energy, I'm effectively minimizing risk and ambiguity. And in terms of a unifying theory of unifying theories, this actually gracefully accommodates a number of takes on the way that we epistemically forage the world. So if I ignore this extrinsic value here, then we're left with this thing, which is just the information gain or the reduction of uncertainty that I would get if I looked over there or made that move. In the visual search literature, it's used. It's called Bayesian surprise. And information theory, it's just a mutual information between the causes and consequences consequent on making that move as opposed to that move. If I take another kind of uncertainty off the table, namely the ambiguity, I'm left with risk-sensitive control, which is just basically scoring the difference between states of affairs out there, if I make that behavior, relative to my prior preferences. So we've come back, this is, if you like, a grown-ups version of optimal control theory, where you're putting a certain kind of uncertainty into the game, namely the risk. And if I take away all uncertainty, I'm just left with this quantity, which is the expected value, and we have good old-fashioned Bellman optimality principles and expected utility theory. So I'll close now by trying to say, well, why is this useful for framing all the kind of mechanics that we've been talking about, network theory, graph theory, and the like? Well, I've been talking about generative models. If you subscribe to the notion we're all in the game of maximizing the evidence for our models of the world, that requires there to be a model or a generative model. You can always write down a generative model in terms of a probabilistic graphical model. If you can do that, you can always write that down in terms of a factor graph. What the factor graph gives you is the requisite message passing required to invert or make sense of any observable outcomes O here, by essentially inverting that generative model in a Bayesian sense, which means that at the heart of understanding computational anatomies and the architectures on which they live is a graph, and implicitly an appeal to graph theory formulations of message passing on graphs that usually are very deep graphs. I just included this as a nod to the importance of the hierarchical aspects of graphs that we talked about. And also, as you go deeper into the hierarchy, you get a separation temporal scales, which we've also heard about in terms of fast versus slow and their age dependencies. You get that essentially for free just by building these little factor graphs on top of each other, or putting slow transitions and flows on top of faster things lower down at the hierarchical levels. The off-the-shelf message passing schemes that would be apt for those kinds of factor graphs look very much like the neural mass models that people use to simulate activity and indeed understand neuronal message passing in terms of perception, associative plasticity, and learning in terms of the parameters of the generative model, and indeed action selection. You can carve out rough functional anatomies based upon the functional form of the message passing implied by the factor graph that inherits from a specification of your hierarchical or deep generative model. This is the first slide, so I've only officially used 5 slides, but what I wanted to do, I start off by saying, well, look, there's an imperative to maximize evidence for our models of the world. How do we actually do that? Well, we do it with these structured flows on manifolds where those flows via the Helmholtz decomposition can be decomposed into a gradient flow that optimizes the model evidence, the log probability of outcomes given a model. That's denoted by gamma here, but is always accompanied in virtue of the Helmholtz decomposition with this irrotational, non-dissipative or solenoidal flow. And this is the thing that does the mixing. And of course, if you put this mixing into that hierarchical generative model, then you've got hierarchical mixing. I've never used those words before, so I hope that Gustavo is there and smiling in the background. So that would be, if you like, the practical way of putting this message passing on factor graphs into a real world setting where we now understand neuronal dynamics as structured flows on manifolds that, I repeat, are a statistical manifold and therefore equipped with an information geometry. So I'll finish there and give the last word to Einstein, just as a nod to remind you that evidence is just simplicity plus accuracy, namely everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And with that, I just need to thank those people whose ideas I've been talking about. And of course, thank you for your attention. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, once again, Karl, in the virtual age, you just get the chair clapping, but I'm sure there's a chorus of hundreds, 208 people who very much enjoyed the unifying theory of unifying theories. Just 2 things come to mind for me while others collect their thoughts. And I know you've already thought and written about this, but I'll ask the question anyway. And that is, you know, given the discussion that Susan just initiated about metabolic energy, and then you've been discussing sort of surprise, the sort of information-free energy, how close, in terms of a, you know, omnipresent unifying theory, is Gibbs-free energy, which is all about work and energy and joules and things that we can measure with, you know, thermometers, and Fristonian free energy. Are they, you know, is it always that there's a metabolic cost that scales in proportion to this surprisal term in your formulation, you know, through synaptic chatter and synaptic plasticity? Or is that really just a metaphorical, but not necessarily a one-to-one mapping? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, my thoughts are very simple. It's a mathematical isomorphism. So very, very clearly, any movement on that statistical manifold, any belief update has a very precise and exact thermodynamic cost that you can measure in joules. You just need to multiply the distance you move, the degree of belief updating, by Boltzmann's constant and temperature. And that will give you in joules the amount of energy you've used to change your mind. So, you know, the beauty of sort of deriving the statistical physics of inference and working, you know, sort of on statistical manifolds is that the maths that underwrites both Helmholtz and Gibbs free energy is exactly the same as the variational free energy. You know, it's exactly the same maths. And I repeat, via the Janinski equality, you can actually compute. If you change your mind from this to that in the face of new data, you can compute the thermodynamic cost of that, which is the computational complexity. Which tells you that a good computer should be very, very small, very cool, and just work on batteries.
Okay. Okay, so there's some questions appearing in the Q&A. And Sophia Zangilla, would you like, and then a follow-up by Thomas. Would you like to ask these by unmuting yourself, or should I read them out? Okay, I'll read them out then. Is the search for one unifying theory motivated only from our beliefs that such a theory exists or should exist? Or is there a logical experimental rationale that supports the unifying theory? I guess, are we just seeking simple explanations? This is a sort of ontological question, I guess. Or is there really a simple unifying theory out there that we're approximating with our cognitive beliefs?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that, but yeah, if you pursue the free energy principle, that's exactly right. And your use of the word approximate, I think, is actually very, very appropriate in this context. So notice that that free energies are bound on evidence. It's not exact inference. It's approximate Bayesian inference. It's bounded rationality that is doable and realizable in a physical system. And if we as scientists are compelled to find very simple explanations of the world, then yes, you are obliged to find a unifying theory that's as simple as possible. Well, that's a bit of a philosophical. So you should answer that. You should find a philosopher who can answer that question.
Yeah, well, I mean, the complexity of the microscopic movement of the universe has to collapse onto these synchronization manifolds, or these structured flows on manifolds, or, we'd never have figured any of it out. I mean, if we were dealing with the microscopic equations, I mean, this is statistical thermodynamics, if the theory was no more than a metaphor, then we would be dealing with the microscopic degrees of freedom, and everything would be utterly incomprehensible. So there definitely are these Hermann Harkin enslaving principles and these things out there that support life and support meaningful action and support comprehensibility. So Thomas Varley, you're skeptical that evolution would have a selection pressure that would evolve a system to have an aesthetically pleasing solution. So I just kind of must have read that and tried to make a counterfactual out of it. But do you want to speak to a contrary view?
Yeah, I do. Although I'd like to hear your answer to that. The reason I do is I think it nicely speaks to Alex's and Jean-Pierre's presentation earlier on. So I thought it was a wonderful discussion and presentation, and music to the eyes of a free energy principle enthusiast, because natural selection is read as Bayesian model selection in my world, and the adaptive fitness of the objective function is just the model evidence of the marginal likelihood. So the frequency of occurrence of a particular phenotype just is the likelihood of finding that particular phenotype in an ensemble that is bounded by the free energy. So natural selection just becomes free energy minimization. And literally, if you take replicator dynamics or the Fisher fundamental theorem, and you just look at it through a different lens, they are simply Bayesian filters. It's basically the phenotype embodying the evidence for what works in that particular environment, which is very closely related to or provides an evolutionary take on things like the good regulator theorem. So for those people who don't know, the good regulator theorem was one of the key outputs of early formulations of synergetics, which just says that if you want to survive in a controllable world, you have to be a model of that world, which means that if you are now looking at natural evolution, natural selection as Bayesian model selection for the good generative models of that eco-niche, and that eco-niche is encultured. And I thought that was a very important thing that Jean-Pierre brought to the table. Then you have to you now have a mathematically precise and crisp specification of why there is selective pressure for increasing sparsification and hierarchicalization of humanoid brains that are the only brains that have to model an encultured world with language. Because you could argue that viruses don't do that, and they haven't done that, and they survive very well, thank you very much. So that would be my argument. But what would your counter, your pushback be?
Can I make a suggestion, Michael? One of the Thomas Farley's been trying to pipe in on this. Can you unmute him and allow him to also contribute? I think he has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was reading out his question there. Sorry, thank you, Thomas.
Sorry, it's very early in the morning here, so I'm not operating on all cylinders. First, thank you, Karl, for a fascinating talk. There's a lot here that I'm interested in digging into. But I get that you've already sort of answered the question before I asked it. But the sort of example that I keep coming back to is if you've ever done like evolutionary programming, trying to evolve like a quadratic equation solver in Lisp or something like that, you almost always end up with a function that a computer programmer would very much struggle to interpret, right? You get like what we call like spaghetti code and all those things. So I get what you're saying about, overall, the process of natural selection being, this very elegant kind of Bayesian structure. But it doesn't seem clear to me that the outputs of that, elegant Bayesian structure would ever be comprehensible to us, right? Because like I said in the original question, evolution, there's no selective pressure for an aesthetically pleasing or simple or even comprehensible system, right? I'm starting to ramble, so I'll just shut up. But did you get what I'm saying?
No, it's an excellent question. I think technically, and we don't have time to talk about it, it's actually a really interesting question, which I haven't heard posed before. My guess is that the genetic algorithms that one were using had an objective function that didn't include the complexity term. So you probably just wrote down how close is this to the solution that I desire. And therefore you've forgotten about the complexity. If you put complexity into the adaptive fitness in your genetic algorithm, then you should for free get a refactorization of the code that will become literally more interpretable and sparser. And I use the word refactorization there deliberately because on the one hand, that speaks to the other take on free energy minimization or complexity minimization, which is compression. So there's a whole literature on minimum description length and minimum message length and algorithmic complexity, which tells exactly the same story. It's a story that underwrites universal computation. So if you have the right objective function in your differential evolution or genetic algorithm, or even a sort of Gibbs sampler, then you should get really simple factorized code. The other thing that speaks to in that factorization is a certain modularity, which has been a recurrent theme throughout this meeting. That a key aspect of these generative models and their refactoring and simplification, the minimization of the degrees of freedom, the pruning, the minimization of the computational complexity, is a way of carving a description of the world into a number of independent factors. And that's known as the mean field approximation in physics. And just speaking to Michael's point, if we didn't have a mean field approximation, we wouldn't have temperature and all the good stuff that we know in terms of physics. If we didn't have mean field approximations in the brain, we wouldn't have any functional segregation or modular structure. So things like the what and where system can be thought of as a refactoring of what would otherwise be spaghetti code that did not conform to the principle of minimum message length. So let me turn the question back on you. If you try and do that, if people have tried to do that, have they used the right objective function?
I don't know, but I really want to go try. That may be my weekend project.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. Athena, you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute and fire away?
Yes. Thank you, Karl. It's always a pleasure hearing your presentations. The more I hear you present and more I read your papers, the more I understand. It's not completely there, but I try to get it. So I wanted to comment on the fact, like the fact that you propose a unifying theory. A unifying theory is, it's almost like provocative to try find the exception to the rule. So it's very like automatic thing to do. And I think I had one, and that actually bothered me some days now. So since you're here, maybe you can help me clarify it. It has to do, like, if we take like we are made to suppress prediction errors in order to survive. How come we take drugs and we abuse drugs? Because they induce prediction errors. So why we do that intentionally? That actually our judgment is getting so fuzzy that this is not in our favor.
So a challenging and lovely question. I was smiling a little bit because, of course, it was Randy who thought that there was a unifying theory. It wasn't me. That was the title I was given.
No, I apologize for
that. I don't take drugs. You know,
why not?
Actually, I do. I smoke, don't I? So I do, and I want, yes. Now I want a cigarette. So why do we do that? I think that the answer, you know, it speaks to something which was in the philosophy literature, you know, a few years ago, which is a dark room problem. I think that you know, there is when you think about minimizing your surprise or prediction error in the future, what does that mean? Well, the average surprise or the expected surprise in the future is called uncertainty. So average self-information is called entropy. So that just means the average prediction error is basically uncertainty. So what that means is that minimizing prediction error in the moment should be distinguished from choosing those behaviors that are going to minimize the average prediction error after you have committed to a particular action. The kinds of behaviors that do that minimization are exactly those kinds of behaviors that make us into curious creatures and scientists. So it's the epistemic imperatives that are responsible for actually guiding our actions and behavior, even though we now reconfigure and do our structured flows on manifolds to minimize the prediction errors once we've got the data. But in the getting of the data, in doing our bungee jumping, in taking your drugs, you know, be they cigarettes or whatever, then you are compelled to actually seek out salience and novelty in the service of minimizing expected surprise, i.e. minimizing uncertainty. And that becomes actually fundamental understanding the importance of doing stuff. So this is the inactive aspect of active inference, which is why I sort of picked up on Randy's, you know, the special kind of beliefs about the things we are going to do may be particularly important in terms of defining us as non-sessile creatures and therefore inherently curious creatures, at least when we're young, or drug taking.
So many thoughts are coming out, but I don't want to take over the discussion. But yeah, I think it's a kind of makes sense. And at the same time, I'm thinking, like, evolutionarily, do we learn something more? Like changing our perception, changing our consciousness, if you want. Like, well, we learn something new by that.
I think we occupy some of these counterfactual states that we've been discussing, because most of the drugs we use are, you know, like marijuana. THC, for example, is an agonist of one of the brain's most plentiful neuroreceptors. So just as we were speaking before about changes in temperature or changes in pharmacology allow us to explore latent states or the dynamic repertoire or counterfactual states in Anil's talk. perspective. So I know when I take drugs, legal ones like THC, you do take an alternative perspective. There is a slight dilation or contraction of time. There is there's a perspective taking that is different. So it's probably just what Karl was saying. It decreases your longer term uncertainty by satisfying or decreasing the latent uncertainty in a state that you can go and visit and learn about. And it's actually very similar to this question that Fard Yazin has asked. So Fard, do you want to unmute and ask, or do you want me to read out your question? Okay, I'll read it out then. Although agents... great.
Yeah, hi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Karl, for the lovely talk. He did unify a lot of, at least my predictions, in a lovely way. So you answered my question in many ways in Athena's question about why we would take drugs if it induces prediction errors. But what I want to ask was from a different perspective, like, could it be that the systems inside the brain would be competing with itself? Like, for instance, certain areas, say like striatum, amygdala, and all that, would have a different free energy belief that they would like to make survive. But other systems like lateral frontal cortex or say medial orbitofrontal cortex might have a completely different competitive approach towards that. So they're in some ways a generative adversarial network sort of way. And maybe an easier way to say this example would be a little illegal way rather than drugs would be most people when they have some kind of anxiety or depression, not in a clinical way, but day-to-day sense, they might open their phone and look at something very novel and very reward feeling, as if the primal brain areas might be wanting to conserve their belief, but the other half of the, say, neocortical areas might want to go against that belief.
I will try and answer that briefly. I think it's the kind of question a lot of people here would like to answer. Generative adversarial networks, no, I personally do not think that that's an appropriate computational science or machine learning metaphor for the brain. I think it's much more like a variational autoencoder. Having said that, I won't qualify why I think that's the case. But having said that, I do think there's an element of competition in play here, in virtue of the fact that if you commit to the sort of Bayesian gloss on accounting for our sentient behavior, if it's behavior, we can only do one thing at a time. If we can only do one thing at a time, we have to select among all those, that hidden repertoire of things we can do. That selection is Bayesian model selection. So there's an implicit winner-take-all-like competition in any inference that leads to an action, simply in virtue of the fact that you can only do one thing at any one time. So I certainly think there are going to be competing parts of the brain in terms of supplying evidence for this hypothesis about what I'm going to do next, as opposed to that hypothesis. And one set of competitors will certainly win. So I think the notion of competition is absolutely crucial to understanding an inactive inference in the service of selecting the thing that I'm actually going to do next. In relation to drugs, I'm just mindful, there are certain drugs that you could take just to see what would happen if I took this. What is it like to take LSD? And that would certainly be sort of consistent with the vanilla epistemic affordance of taking the drug. There are other drugs, though, that actually direct upon our neuronal representations of the stress and uncertainty that the behavior would normally be in play to resolve. So certain drugs of addiction, for example, would be the sort of poster children of drugs that get into the neuromodulatory control of the precision, which is just another way of expressing uncertainty. So precision is inverse variance. So if you read the representation of uncertainty as being the representation of precision, that's going to have a very, very close relationship with the valence of certain belief states. And in that close relationship between the classical neuromodulators and valenced and possibly even affective or emotional states, that you can, if you like, short circuit your inference just by taking those drugs directly, or if you're a lucky mouse, doing self-stimulation with electrodes implanted in the right cells of origin.
Thanks. Just one follow-up question, if you don't mind. Why do you say you don't see the brain as a generative adversarial network? Because it implicitly has a discriminator in it, right, to choose a select action policies.
Yes. It's just that the physical, sorry, the neuroanatomical and physiological evidence at hand would suggest a message passing scheme that doesn't quite have the architecture of a generative adversarial network. It will have the same objective as a generative adversarial network, and it will have the same benefits in terms of finding the simplest explanation. It's just that the architecture, it seems to be much more like a variational autoencoder folded back on itself. So you've got the compressed higher or deeper layers of a variational autoencoder can be, if you like, likened to these cores described by Alex, in fact, not described by Alex as sort of the global network, in terms of global networks, or somebody, I think Michael's talking about hubopathies, so there could be deep hubs. So I think that's the kind of architecture that we're seeing in the wetware that the brain possesses, that has evolved by evolution, not sort of right hemisphere and left hemisphere trying to predict each other.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Randy in a moment, but I completely agree, Karl, with this formulation of, say, stimulant drugs in particular, just creating sort of deep wells in the free energy valley in the face of boredom and ennui. And, you know, I worked in the prison for 5 years, and it's like to get back to culture, it's like a cultural dark room, much, much worse than a perceptual dark room. The sort of lack of cultural variability and the lack of counterfactual spaces are, I guess, why we put people in prison, because, you know, they're terrible places. And they're places where stimulant drugs are used in copious quantities, brought in by, you know, many, many routes into the prison. So anyway, with those vague wanderings, Randy has his hand up, and I'll allow you and Randy to have the last words for the conference.
Oh, thank you. First of all, congratulations, Karl, on holding on to the title of the talk I gave you, and actually doing a very good job of satisfying its intentions. So, and I apologize for the questions that were criticizing you for trying to even do that. So, but you know, there's always a risk.
Randy, before you go on, I can sense, I don't think we're going to have time for a sort of a round table with the audience about what we got right and got wrong, but I just personally, on behalf of the attendees, just wanted to thank you and your team for putting this together. You know, it's been a really, so, you know, for those people that we can't clap and we can't say it out loud because there's too many of us, but on behalf of everybody, thank you so much. It's been brilliant.
No, I will do closing arguments, but I think it's been a remarkable success given the challenges of this current situation, and then we've managed to at least capture some of the souls for brain connectivity.
And I should finish my chairing of the day by thanking the organisers and thanking Tanya and thanking all of the presenters, including thank you, Karl, for your lovely last talk. And thank all 6 presenters today, including Alex for jumping in at last moment. So thank you, and thank you to the participants for the day.
Okay, then I want to ask a question.
No, you can
No,
ask
you just closed the session, so I guess we're done.
No, I'll just shrink into the background now. You ask Karl your question, and that can be the dialogue.
All right, all right. I think it's a brief question, but it's actually kind of thinking about the next steps in terms of what we want to try and achieve as a collective, and the notion of trying to merge the different scales over which we exist, and whether that can be done in the framework you put forward, Karl. Because one of the challenges that I've encountered in thinking about multi-scale causation, for example, is something that Victor and I talked about a lot as well. How to link up the interactions between different parts of the brain, and then you think about that embedded in the body again, and then in terms of its cultural, social cultural context as well. Each of those can be characterized within your framework, and then the notion is that just simply extending the hierarchy. And if that happens, then do you sort of lose something again in terms of what gets sort of glossed over as you try and bridge different scales? Because I don't know if there's been a solution that I've seen that actually can do that well without having to potentially lose some of the richness, if you will, that's within each of the levels.
Yeah, I just make a few general comments to that, which speak to the things like what has already been mentioned, the fact that this group and the presumably the audience has a very diverse range of skills. Implicit in those skills is exactly this sort of multi-scale approach. So my answer to that would be that to make any of our theories work, then they have to be unpacked practically in terms of the neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology and the empiricism and the mechanics. And that's just basically our day job. And clearly that's going to be a multi-scale, and scale-free aspects have sort of predominated much of this workshop and all previous workshops. And I think once you acknowledge that, then you've got your focus is on basically committing to your scale, but also committing how you relate to the scale above and the scale below. So that's going to be done collectively. It's going to have to be done collectively by people working all the right scales. So my sort of platitude in response to you is, well, we're already doing that, literally, but also specifically in the attempt of this kind of workshop, which is to get all the different scales talking to each other.
Sure. I mean, I guess it's just a question of the formalism that allows us to put it together. It's not an easy task, honestly. And I think, I appreciate the sentiment, Karl, that this is actually sort of a goal of the workshop. And it is. I mean, and I think the fact that we've had this workshop going on for almost 20 years, that we've made huge progress towards that. And it's just, this is sort of the next, I guess, challenge that faces us. And I think we have a way forward. It's just a question of continuing to do that as a group. So I think that's actually a good way to end this meeting. So, Dr. Breakspear, would you agree?
Yeah, I was just looking through all the other panelists and all the speakers from the other days, and all our colleagues and friends. So, 20 odd years, and every year there are new people, and hopefully all the new people will come next year. I don't have anything wise to say, but do we have any vague theories of where we might meet, probably in person next year?
So let me pass the baton to Petra on that, since she's actually part of the group that's thinking about the next BCW.
Right, thank you, Randy. So indeed, Simon Eickhoff, Klaus Hilgetag, and myself are the organizers of the next workshop, and we have already booked a building for that in Düsseldorf. So the next brain connectivity workshop will take place from 13th of June to 15th of June in 2022 in person. Hopefully.
Wonderful. Thank you, Petra. That's excellent news. I'm just going to share my screen. Again, huge thanks to all the speakers. This meeting really inspires me because it does involve discussions that you typically don't have when you're sitting in your office or when you're sitting at your homes under quarantine or lockdown. So I'm very pleased that we managed to capture some of the spirit of brain connectivity.
Randy, one small comment at the end. First of all, totally second your thanks, and we've organized this meeting twice, really. So we really put this together a year and a half ago, and then had to skip last year. One thought is, we've done this online for the first time, and as I was witnessing these sessions, there are some aspects of the online format that are actually positive and perhaps should be retained. I'm wondering whether we might solicit some feedback from participants and other people in the community as to how should we think about next year if we do go back to the real world. I mean, one default option is we just go back to how we've always done it. But I wonder if some of the accessibility and interactivity that the additional online format might bring could be retained. Yeah. To have not a hybrid meeting, but have an in-person meeting with the capacity of bringing people in who can't travel, who don't want to travel, or simply joining from remote places to contribute. And that might be something you want to think about. And I would say we should solicit some feedback from people in the room now, but also beyond, and see how we can incorporate that.
Indeed.
That's a great point, Olaf. And just to note to the attendees that we have a survey prepared that will include some information on that topic exactly. So we'll definitely be anxious to hear how your experience was. And
I feel very strongly about broadening the geographic range of science in general on this planet, and not just limited to people who are privileged to have the funds and the capacity to travel to far off and sometimes remote locations. So I think we really should think more about how we can truly make this a global event each year. And in addition to having an in-person component, obviously, which I think is much preferable in many ways to the online format.
Agreed.
Okay, yeah. So we will take care of this. I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. In the pause in the conversation, and since we have the thank you slide still up and Tanya is there on camera, I want to again express my sincere gratitude to Tanya, who was basically the lead for pulling all this together 2 times, again, this time in person. So I'm going to clap on my side, but I think Tanya did a fantastic job in pulling this all together. It's incredibly smooth given the challenges. So thanks again, Tanya. In addition, Tanya is now going to be transitioning potentially to a new job. So even though she's been part of BCW, going back at least as far as Montreal, if I'm not mistaken, Tanya, and has helped co-organize at least 3 or 4 of these meetings. So, but since she'll be in Germany next year, she'll be able to come as a special guest, if not actually a participant. So again, thank you, Tanya, for all your help over the years as well. I appreciate it.
Absolutely my pleasure. And I look forward to what's to come. Thank you.
Just a couple of things, like the recordings will be shared. I'll leave this up for a second. People want to get the code scanned. We will try and get, or we in the URL sense, will try and get the recordings edited and up as soon as possible. It's a very rich discussion, so I like to save those. And in addition, for those who don't know, we are planning to have a special issue for network neuroscience devoted to this meeting. I don't know all the details yet of who is going to contribute, but I know that people have at least in principle agreed to contribute. And there'll be a special paper from Karl, Susan, and myself that will follow from one that we actually did for the first meeting. What does the brain think of the mind? And we'll turn it around now and say, after all 20 years, what does the mind think of the brain? So that'll be a challenging paper to put together. I'm looking forward to working with Karl and Susan on that. And finally, again, Petra mentioned we'll be in Dusseldorf, so I'm hoping I will see some of you there, at least in person, and definitely see some of you virtually. So again, thank you everybody for participating. And with that, I will close the meeting and wish you all happy journeys and enjoy your weekend that's coming up very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.